are trying to start this panel. I'll start with some logistics, and then we'll go straight into the main issues that gathering you in this panel. My name is Nitzan. My last official assignment, I was the head of the Counter-Terrorism Bureau in Israel. I did it for 5 years. And I have the privilege to try to manage those people. I know it's very tough. I know a few of them, they are very, very tough to be managed. But I hope that they will be polite enough and don't embarrass me too much. I'm going to ask you to control your cellular. Make sure that they are not making noise. This is the first logistics. The second is that we have enough time in this panel. So we decided that each of the panel members have something like 25 minutes to present his topics, including questions from the audience. We will have another session of questions by the end of the panels after all the 5 people will finish their topics. And if we feel that we need a break in the middle of the session, we will take a break. But we have, all in all, 3 hours, which is enough to discuss and make sure that we understand the topics that the panel members are bringing into the table. I ask them to be very specific and to be very operational. So when you are leaving the room, you will have better tool to not only understand the phenomena, but also tools to deal with them. The ICT, I think that this is the 3rd year, decided to memorize those panels on behalf of those who graduate from their studying. And this panel is on behalf of Major Tsafrir Bar-Or, that was a commander in the Golani Brigade. I'll say few personal words because I knew him, and we share the same positions in the Golani Brigade. I was the platoon commander in 83, 84, and he was the same platoon commander in 97, 98, 2007, 2008. And just before he had been killed, I had the privilege to speak with him because he took the initiative to write the historical stories of the platoon that we both commanded in our past. And we spoke something like 20 minutes by the phone, and we decided, because we are living very close to each other, I'm living in the Gilboa and he's living in the Gilboa, and we decided that we have to meet each other and speak in order to see how to conduct the book. And unfortunately, we couldn't achieve it because, as I said, he had been killed during the last operation Gaza Strip. Major Tsafrir Bar-Or graduated from the class of 2012 from the Lauder School of Government, Diplomacy and Strategy at the IDC. Served in the Golani Brigade as a combat soldier in the Orev unit, which is the anti-tank missile. As a combat soldier, then worked his way up in the various command positions as the officer of the Golani Brigade. Tsafrir led complex combat operation in every combat zone and conflict area his unit took part in, with a very professional and very brave way. About a month before completing his last position as a deputy commander of the Golani Commando Battalion and his way to become a battalion commander in the brigade, Tsafrir was killed during the battle in Sajaiya in Gaza during the Operation Protective Edge. Tsafrir left behind his parents, a sister, his wife Sivan, and his daughter Lian, who was then 1 year old at that time. His son Nuriel was born approximately 3 months after he was killed. Tsafrir was one of the most promising commanders. He was known of his very professionalism and very creativity. He constant care for his soldier and his always smile. We could say that even in very tough situation, when he smiled, we understood that he controlled the situation and he knows what to do. Tsafrir was devoted to his family. Even his soldier knew that when he received video of his little girl, the whole world stands still. During snowy winter, while the unit was in the Ramat Golan, when it was very snowing and almost everything was stacked, he asked his commanding squad soldier to take his picture writing in the snow, "I love you, Sivan," so he could surprise his wife, who missed him back home. When his wife and daughter came to his military base to spend the weekend with him, he had urgent issues to take care of, but sent an officer to wait for them near the gate holding a rose. Think about a very tough combat Golani soldiers ask someone to provide a rose to his family while they're coming to visit him. Tsafrir was an excellent commander, great colleague, romantic and loving family guy, a magnificent combination of sensitivity and bright guy. May his memory be blessing. Thanks, and we will start, Shira, with you. I'm not going to present the panelists. They are going to do it by themselves. They will do it better than me. So please, you have your time, you have your topic, and good luck.
Hello. Hi. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you, ICT, for inviting me. My name is Shira Efron. I'm a policy researcher with the RAND Corporation based in Santa Monica. I'm a dual Israeli-US citizen. I've lived back and forth all my life, and it's a really honor to be here because I think among the panel experts, I'm probably the least experienced in this matter. I'm going to talk more about the role of civil society in countering violent extremism. So it constitutes the less hard power approach. Just very quickly, what I'm going to talk about. There's a lot of confusion about the terms and definitions. What are the drivers of radicalization? Why civil society even matters, the specific roles that it can have, a few examples, and the key lessons learned from over a decade of experience in civil society programs. So, starting with the terms and definitions. You know, I was invited to talk about proactive tools for countering terrorism, but I'm talking about violent extremism. What is violent extremism? Basically, I mean, as this definition implies, and you can all read it, violent extremism is broader than terrorism. So it includes terrorism, but it includes also other forms of ideologically motivated violence. It's a more nuanced term, I think, but also in the United States, where I live and work, we found that this term is less contentious politically. Radicalization is the process by which individuals become violent extremists. So what is CVE? This goes at a different pace than I thought. It's basically unlimited range of activities to prevent radicalization and in turn violent extremism, including messaging, engagement and outreach, community development, and education and training. One definition that is missing from here, but it's probably should be included because this is the topic of the presentation, is what is civil society? The formal definition is all voluntary civic and social organizations and institutions that form the basis of a functioning society, as opposed to the structures of the state and the market. What am I talking about in practice? Community groups, NGOs, the frontline workers that can work for, you know, public schools, the teachers, the coaches, health professionals, community police, and others that are in touch with community day to day, and finally the general public. what does the literature tells us about the drivers of radicalization? Why does one become violent extremist? Well, the bad news is that there's no single path toward radicalization. There's no set profile that one can talk about. It's a mixture of factors, and really depending where you sit, you stress some factors over others. This is just a broad framework of how to look at it. There are 4 types: the divisions, the grievances, narratives, and means. By divisions, we can talk about the lack of integration, perceived or real isolation. Grievances, those are clearly not, there are many places in the world where there's unemployment and underemployment and lack of education, and people don't become terrorists, but we've seen these correlations. Narratives, we cannot deny the role of ideologies and faith in some places, and means, and here I think the important thing to stress is the social, family, and often criminal networks of individuals. So given the drivers of radicalization that we just saw, and many of them are really the product of government policies, why civil society? Well, government are often challenged conducting community-level interventions at a local level, especially with groups that try to break away with government. And therefore, the civil society is often better placed to conduct these interventions. Now, this is not to say that the governments are not important, on the contrary, but it just seems that governments need to acknowledge, and many have, in fact, around the world, the importance of civil society and work to create these partnerships. Specifically, what are the advantages of civil society in CVE? Many ways. First of all, they can tackle the underlying economic, social, and political drivers of radicalization. Yes, government, they deal with the infrastructure, with the systemic inequalities. But for things to work and trickle down to the community, civil society has to help. Second, they can play a role in terms of narratives and messages. As I just mentioned, they are better placed to counter radicalizers and extremists and put forward positive alternatives. One of the interesting things is that radicalizers seek to exploit certain grievances and certain narratives that people have, and what civil society can create is a safe space for discussing these, and democratic forums that give some sort of a platform for these narratives to be aired out and addressed. Also, through improved parenting, neighborhood support, and community resilience, civil society can help spot signs of vulnerability and work bottom up to protect individuals from being radicalized. Now, the civil society response in that regard is day-to-day life. It's not a specific intervention, but communities need to be strong enough to do this. And one thing that was found to be really important is intergenerational relationships. If the youth, if the young totally depart from the older members of community, this is really a bad sign. Civil society can also help in the de-radicalization process. There was a workshop, I think yesterday, on de-radicalization, so I won't go into this. But what we're talking about are programs that are directed at individuals that have become radicalized, and you want to reintegrate them in society, or at the very least dissuade them from conducting violent actions. And community leaders can play a leading role in this, especially if you include staff and volunteers that have been radicalized themselves and de-radicalized. And finally, a UK government report from 2010 stated that some of the best local information may be gathered at the neighborhood level. It can be even by street cleaners. Once they have this, they know what to do with this information. They see something that's a departure from the norm, but they don't know what it means. So training them on what this information means and who to pass it along is very important. Clearly, for community members to play this role, they have to trust the authorities. And that's often a barrier, but if you can overcome this, this can be a very effective tool. So going back to our framework, we can look at, I think civil society-based programs have started in Europe. I think in 2005. There have been a few more in the United States after September 11th. So we have over a decade of programs to look into, and generally they try to address the different types of drivers of radicalization. Citizenship teaching, interfaith dialogue, after-school clubs, training, employment, making sure young people have something to do after school, or if they don't go to school, just something to do. Sports, you know, it can be boxing, it can be soccer, it can be political clubs, legitimate political clubs and legal ones, and also training for those frontline workers. There are, as I said, there are tons of examples. Some are better than others. Let's just, I'll give you just a little bit more context. Street, it's the Strategy to Reach, Empower and Educate program in the UK in South London. This is a program that aims to reach and engage young Muslims who are outside mainstream activities. And by mainstream, I mean they're also outside of the mosques, which is important. Point to make. It was set by the community and for the community, and this is something that has been proven really effective. This has to be voluntary. If it's all paid work and all comes from government, usually it's not very effective. And they do four things. Outreach, they include, they have, you know, here, they have soccer clubs, they have the boxing clubs, recreational activities. They actually deliver curriculum. Education, after-school programs. They provide counseling, both psychological, but also just training people on how to get a job. And finally, they have their own in-house media, so they work to counter the propaganda of extremist groups. The next program is COPRA, Community Policing and the Prevention of Radicalization. This is in Belgium. This assumes that the community police, that people that are actually, you know, on the ground, serving a community, if they do it right, they can prevent radicalization better because they work on the ground and they tend to have better community ties and they know the communities. What they did is really unique. They created a kind of a pocketbook. It's a practical, user-friendly tool to support the frontline officers in detecting the signs of radicalization. And it includes information. I looked at it, it's like what tattoos should raise a mark, what symbols that they use. They also developed a more common curriculum to how to effectively use this pocketbook. And they created a platform for exchanging information and good practices on how to stop the spread of radicalization using this tool. But they don't limit it just to police. They work with the local partners. Finally, I think the plan that is getting the most attention now, I don't know if anyone have heard of it, but it's the Preventing Discrimination and Radicalization in Aarhus, Denmark. They don't like this name, but some people have called this program Hug a Terrorist. The police there is basically says, you know, we're not cuddling terrorists. This is not what we're trying to do. But we found that doubling down on people that are being radicalized often doesn't help. This specific town in Denmark in 2012 had 36 people go to Syria. Some have come back, some have been killed, some are still there. In 2015, they pride themselves of sending just one, and that was a year when many communities in Europe did send more. As always, we don't know if it's because of the program or not. It's too early to say. But what they're doing is, in the last 4 years, basically, they've designed a program that is really holistic across the community. And they look at radicalization as another parameter that's important to look at. But it's also like shoplifting and dropping out of school. So all these things they consider not par with each other, but as important to strengthening a community. I think it's also interesting because while they're trying to address and lower radicalization born by extreme Islamist ideology, in Denmark there's an issue of extreme right. So they don't view this as more just anti-Islam. It's also to reduce the radicals that they have on the right. There are quite a few lessons learned, so I'll try to rush through these. First of all, getting these interventions right is extremely difficult. As we said, they depend on trust. Trust is not something you build on the institutional level. You build on the personal level. So relationships matter. Those plans have to be sustainable in the long term. As we all know, political cycles can cut funding for programs. Often funding is restricted and short term. If you're not in it for the long term, that's what we saw. These programs are not effective. The personal credibility is important. The target audience, they need to relate to the people working with them. It can be from the same age, the same sex, the same religion. A great credibility trait is those people that have been radicalized and de-radicalized themselves. They can relate to them much better than other people. It does not mean that you need a team of only people that you can relate to, but you need a mix of the professionals, the psychologists, the social workers, and others, but also it's really good to have those credible voices on your team. I spoke about the commitment. Commitment is important. We know civil society and government, especially on security-oriented issues, there's not always a willingness to partner. All sides have to be committed to this effort. Information sharing is really critical. We know that a lack of information sharing can inhibit an effective response. Now, don't get me wrong. I really, working at the RAND Corporation, I really value the fact that you keep intel classified. However, it is important that information gathered by the security services, even if a watered-down version, would be shared with the people that are supposed to act in the communities. It's important for two reasons. First of all, if they don't have a full picture of how vulnerable the community is, they can't be effective. The other thing is that if the civil society actors think that the government withholds information from them, that's it. It's the suspicion, lack of trust, and a really good recipe for failure of the program. They're also community sensitives. Often the communities don't want to work with the government. There have been instances in Europe where communities felt that the governments don't care about the community themselves. They see them just as instrumental for the broader fight against radicalization. This has to be perceived as a whole community approach. They have to address all the concerns that the society has. And there are ways to do this. You have to be attentive. They need to be fair. Having competent people acting, this has been proven really helpful, especially in community police. There are a few others. There's an incentive to have to roll out full national plans. That doesn't work. Context matters in every region, in every community. You need confidence and skilled people. Some are, naturally born to do these jobs. This is a really hard job to de-radicalize. Others are not. It doesn't mean that they can't work, but the right skills have to be taught. What we found, which was really interesting, that because there's no clear profile of who's going to become radicalized, the many frontline workers are concerned about their ability to recognize the signs. And they want a support mechanism. They want to have trusted networks so they can say, what do you think about this case? Should I act or not? Spoke about there are sensitivities on the part of communities not inclined to work with government. Clearly, there are sensitivities on the part of government not wanting to work with communities. We know that in certain political climates, that's really impossible to work with communities that have ideologies that seem totally at odds with what the government is trying to do. Sometimes partnerships just don't work and shouldn't work. For instance, a training of religious instructors is not something that the government should do. On the other hand, also spying on the neighborhood, spy on your neighbors policies are not necessarily something communities should be doing. In divisive communities, this can be really destructive for democratic values of societies, and there are more specific. I think in the interest of time, I'll skip this. But one interesting one, we said we can't roll out national plans. I mean, you can, but you have to consider the context. Often these programs have to be tailor-made to the individual level, and that's very hard and takes a lot of resources. So I'll conclude. Clearly, civil society is an integral player in CVE, and this is something that, as I said, many governments around the world, and the cases I know is the U.S., Australia, different countries in Europe and Canada, know that. But if not done right, they can have unintended consequences. And finally, I think, I'm not sure what my fellow panelists are going to talk about, but I have a feeling it's going to be more the hard power. This is considered at the softer end of the spectrum, but in fact, it is really difficult to do. I think it's probably more difficult than just, closing a barrier or getting more intelligence or just locking down people. Thank you.
At that stage, you have to ask questions. They will. This is the right timing to ask Shira questions regarding the topics she presents. And as I promised you, by the end of the panel, we will have another session of asking questions, but this is the time to ask Shira questions. Don't be polite, be tough, otherwise it's not interesting. Yes, sir.
Can you hear me? Is that working? Okay. Well, as I said, and this is important to emphasize, if you look at radicalized people, not all of them are, as you unemployed, poorly educated. This is not one factor, but it's an easy place to, if you look at recruitment pools, these are easy places to get them. I also, and this is something that maybe, I know Brian wrote about it a lot, but Brian Jenkins. But I think there's also a difference in what roles you tend to take in in terrorist groups. I would assume that the more educated and the more skilled can take more leadership roles, and not. But I don't know, Brian. You wanna? But as I said, this is just a variety of factors. On the messaging thing, this is a very hard call. We see it. There are a lot of attempts to counter messages of radicalism in YouTube videos, in Twitter and Facebook, and their effectiveness is very limited. When people come back to their communities, they at least they're under your control. So in a sense, if you try to de-radicalize them, or if you can get to them and lock them down, this is also one effective way. But what this literature on the civil society involvement shows, and the Denmark example shows, is that you try to offer them a different path forward. It doesn't always work. We see the outcomes, but that's the underlying rationale for that. What I'm seeing is that there's definitely, there's the swing, right? What trends do you go? But the recent events in the United States, I think, show clearly that you have to do both. And at least in Los Angeles, where I am, I think the police understands that very well, and also the city government. But I don't know about different police organizations, but from the conversations I've had, they do understand the need to do both. don't have a specific case in mind. I think when we talk about education, there are two different things. First of all, you have to educate the what we call the frontline workers. So that's one thing I was trying to say. You want to educate the police and the mental health workers and the basketball coaches and the soccer coaches and the teachers on how to help detect the signs and how to offer support and how to dissuade people from, when they show the very specific signs. One thing that's really interesting is that you don't want these people to disengage from their society. I think I've heard of examples where it was very clear that, you would go to the mosques and try to talk with the mosque. When you go to the mosque and the people have already disengaged from the mosque, you're almost too late. So in the case of, fundamentalist Muslim terrorism, in the role of education, I think it's not only uneducated people. So as we saw, but creating forums for discussing narratives is one helpful way where you can discuss them in a substantial manner. When you allow people the room to talk about these things, I'm a big believer in education for different societal outcomes, and we see this, with woman empowerment, with youth empowerment. So this is more at the general level. Specific curriculum, specific programs. I can send you some of the information if you'd like. I'll give you my email, and I'll send you some of the information from Europe, because there's specific curriculum. I'm just not familiar with it. This is a big question, and I'm not sure. And again, I think it's context dependent. I know your country well, where you're coming from, where Al-Shabaab is a concern. But it's, I don't think that someone going into a mosque for the first time, someone that want to practice their faith, is that necessarily a bad sign. That's part of the problem, I would say. We can't stigmatize a whole religion, a whole community. The problem is disengaging from your communities, from your constructive, from your support. I don't know if it's a myth or not, but I don't think it's the first time in history we're seeing these things. So I would go with fact, but maybe other people here want to comment on that. So I think and this is why I didn't go into de-radicalization because there was a workshop on it yesterday. Yeah, okay. So there are two different things, and it's important to distinguish. When we talk about preventing radicalization, that's more the stuff that I was talking about, before you cross the line.
The de-radicalization goes to the people that have already crossed the line. And you want to, you know, the best thing would be integrate them to society, very much the way we do with criminals, right? I mean, if we do it effectively. This is not my field of expertise. But, or the very least, what you want to do is protect your society and make sure they don't go into violence and don't attack your own community, your own country. And those are different things. Again, I can talk about de-radicalization. It's just there was a whole workshop about it yesterday. I think some programs proved to be working. I don't know if, I think, Brian, have you worked on this a little bit? Sorry, he's our terrorism expert at Iran, so I defer to him.
It's okay. Am I on? All right. Here's a problem both with preventing radicalization and de-radicalization, and that is we are dealing with very small numbers of individuals, and such small numbers that really idiosyncratic factors are more important than some of the broader factors. So when people compare some of these programs to intervention, for example, to prevent people from joining gangs, that's a large-scale activity, and we can look at the program and we can assess there's a sufficient number of people involved that we can make an assessment that this gang intervention program, which involves not merely law enforcement but social workers, churches, families, and other as well, we can say it's working. If we're looking at criminal populations and generally the problem of offending again after release, and we're trying to make judgments about that, we're dealing with large populations, and these volumes allow us to make assessments. They provide some metrics. When we look at terrorism, I mean, to take the United States as an example, jihadist terrorism in the United States, in the 15-year period since 9/11, we're talking about, out of a population of 320 million people, we're talking about a population of a few hundred. And when we look at that in terms of a profile, an earlier comment made, some of them are well educated. In terms of an educational profile, if we take the profile of those who were arrested and convicted of jihadist-related terrorism crimes, material support to terrorism, attempting to go abroad to join a terrorist front, or more seriously, plotting to carry out a terrorist attack in the United States. So we take that population, we look at their educational distribution. How many are high school dropouts? How many are some college degree, postgraduate degree? We find for the same age demographic no difference from the population at large. Some slight difference, a few more dropouts from college because they changed their major to jihad. But apart from that, no fundamental difference. The education is an indirect indicator of economic status. They come from inner cities, they come from leafy suburbs. We look at criminal records, probably in some cases a higher percentage of at least some involvement with criminal offenses. But look, we're looking at a population primarily of early 20-year-olds, and that's a problematic demographic anyway in terms of brushes with the law. In other words, we can't come up with distinguishing features. So then we look for other things, and we find it is often a matter of personal crisis. Now that gets really hard to predict, because also in terms of radicalization, and this is one of the things that I think we have a problem with in terms of some of the efforts to prevent radicalization, and that is, it is not a trajectory. It's not like a cannon shell leaving the gun that once it does, it's going down range. People can start off on the path of radicalization, continue, accelerate, or detour and go in another direction. They find a job, they fall in love, they lose their girlfriend, they lose their job, they have an unfortunate encounter with life, and now they are radicalizing. It is extremely difficult. Where I'm skeptical about some of these programs is when you look at it in a programmatic sense and you look for metrics and you look for ways to do this wholesale, in a sense, it doesn't, I'm very wary about that working. Now, I'm not saying community policing is bad. I'm not saying good.
Control computing communication, I for intelligence, and surveillance and reconnaissance. These algorithms, here we can find some algorithms, although war, by the way, and that's why you cannot use mathematics and algorithmics and exact predictions. We are speaking about war. War, it's an art. It's not actually science. It's an art. So the art of war suggested the C4ISR as a part of the capability to dominate an area, and we could see the first hint of this capability in 1982 here. In one day, 24 hours, the Israeli Air Force actually destroyed the Soviet, let's say, alignment of anti-aircraft that was deployed in Syria, Soviet type, and 100 jet fighters, Syrians, were shut down in less than 24 hours. So for the first time, this unique capability of C4ISR has been showed in the Middle East for the first time in 1982. But the big time show happened when? First Gulf War. First Gulf War, the RMA and the C4ISR has been showed to the rest of the world by the coalition forces headed by United States of America. Now, that was actually the transformation for two-dimension warfare to three-dimension warfare, from the Great Wars type of war into the RMA, by the RMA into the C4ISR capabilities. And today, if you are not among the C4ISR club, you're not really a key player in the game, let's say, of warfare. But there is a big problem. We have developed, I say we, the free world, the advanced world, let's say the coalition forces, the free world, and we, Israel, developed unique capabilities to block and to avoid invasions. We were under the threat of what has happened to us during 1973 and almost happened to us in 1967. And there was a decision in Israel that it won't happen to us. No, not second Holocaust, not second Masada, and not second 1973 war. The State of Israel will develop the capability to block any invasion attempt from any of its neighbors or others. So the RMA and the C4I and all the Israeli capabilities has been developed, but parallel to what is happening worldwide, it happened to us as well. The enemy has changed totally, and we had an unbelievable, really very impressive capability to destroy brigades, divisions, huge alignments, anti-aircrafts, naval problems, and others with great capabilities, but the enemy has changed. You know, when I was a platoon leader, company commander, even battalion commander, I used to look at the enemy's iceberg, and I could, you know, mark, we call it red eggs of enemy, and to decide what will be the maneuver to dismantle it or to achieve decisive victory. Here's the problem. The problem is that there is something under the iceberg. And not real iceberg anymore. The problem is that we see an industry of terrorism under the iceberg. This is our challenge today. mainly if we speak about C4ISR, this is the ISR challenge. The challenge is to be able to monitor every dot. And we speak today not about division, brigade, or even battalion as an enemy. We speak about the lonely wolf, if he is lonely anymore. The one from the neighborhood, the one that enters to the mosque for that purpose or the other purpose, take a truck in Nice and kill 84 people. One person. This is an unbelievable challenge, isn't it? And one person, you know, drive by ideology, capability, materials that are quite available in any pharmacy, fertilizer for an example, can make suicide belt, take a knife, take a truck, go there and create this spectacle event, Black Swan, in Nice. But not only in Nice, everywhere. So how can we intercept, identify each one of these dots that is a part of this perpetua mobile that does not stop creating terrorism and using all the capabilities of the free world, the advantages that humanity has achieved along the years? What can be done? It's unbelievable challenge. And you know what I want as the commander of the Israeli Special Forces. I was honored to be the commander of the Israeli Special Forces. And you believe me, what an Israeli commander wants is something like this. You know, I need the photo of my target, and I need to know exactly where is the window. Then I will send the team from Shaldag or from Egoz, or I'll send a missile, a guided one, and I'll solve the problem. If I need to avoid collateral damage, I'll have to send my special forces, to be much more accurate and focused. If I can use a guided missile, I'll do that. So that's the challenge. Actually, to make sure you'll be able to have such intelligence from this perpetua mobile that I've shown before. And the problem is that our enemy use our system. You know, they enjoy using all the advantages and the achievements of the free world and the advanced world. And it's a tragedy because they enjoy the Schengen treatment in Europe, because you can land in Zurich and take off in Paris, and you can travel freely in Europe. And you know today that Europe is not the same Europe anymore. And they can use trains as targets and jets as huge bombs and missiles. And who can identify them? They are just there among the people in the crowd. They are lonely, although they are not that lonely. They are a part of ideology. Sometimes it's an organization, sometimes it's a hidden organization, sometimes they use the darknet, sometimes they just use something like a strategic directive, and that's enough. They take the strategic directive of kill people, and that's it, that's enough. We can use anything, a truck, a knife, fertilizers, you name it. It's a big problem. So a target, an enemy can move from 0 to 100 in a heartbeat. In the crowd, who can identify it? How can we do that? How can we cope? How can we fight against such spectacle black swans that change the world? Change the world. So we can understand that our enemies actually use human shields. Riots and armed riots is a part of it. The enemy has changed, as mentioned. It is not divisions anymore, and more than that. They take our capabilities to defend ourselves, our armies, our secret services, mainly, let's say, our armed forces, gendarmeria, police forces. But let's speak about armies. They take you as a part of this phenomena of operations other than war, or OTW. They take you to the multi-dimensional theater. You know, the Battle of Sajahia, where we lost Tsafrir, it's a good example for multi-dimensional battlefield, because you fight on the surface, there are high floors, they fight against you under the ground, and during protective edge operation, we fought against terrorists that came from the sea, under the ground, on the ground, and from the air, and in the net, as they tried even cyber capabilities and efforts, and the psyops and others. It is a multi-dimensional warfare, and they do their best to make sure that they will block the army's capabilities, actually to use their advantages with collecting intelligence and maneuvering. Because you know that when I had to take my division in 2006 to maneuver in South Lebanon against Hezbollah, when you take, let's say, a battalion into an urban theater, you cannot use all your tanks of the battalions. Usually the effective one in the street is the first tank. So you can understand how terrorists, guerrillas, insurgents, the new enemies that we're facing today, take you directly to these theaters, and they would like to take you to the bush, to the mountains, under the ground, urban terrains and others, and it requires different capabilities. Now, I'd like to take you to another way to think about it, okay? When we spoke about two-dimensional warfare, as speaking about industrial warfare, Second World War, First World War, 1973 war, and others, you could see that the forces that we fought against and we ourselves used were forces that were acting as armies, as a part of standard, and they used something like field manuals. So it means that you actually, when you used an industrial warfare, you were working on the lines. There was a paradigm, and you were following the art of war according to field manuals on the lines. Now, when we moved into 3D warfare, you could actually cross lines inside the paradigms, because you could dominate an area and make it a killing box. But here is the problem. The problem is that our rivals today, our enemy today, acts totally differently. And the only paradigm they have is that they have no paradigm. And we have a problem, because we are following regulations. We are nations, we are states, state apparatus require regulations, not only field manuals. How about law? How about law? Morals and values of democracies. And following standards and regulation means that you cannot be effective against enemies that has no paradigm. So what I want as, let's say, leader, commander, someone that needs to create policy and strategic directives and to send any kind of tool in my toolkit to fight effectively against this rival, what I want is to be able to act also out of paradigm. So it's a big problem for a nation, for a state, for Westerners to act out of paradigm. Now, a nation, a democracy, cannot use terror. Not the state of Israel, nor any of the states that participate today in this conference. You cannot use terror, and you cannot use insurgency. But you can bring the official version of terror, guerrilla, and insurgency, the official one and the illegal one, and this is actually another C that is missing in the C for ISR. I'm speaking about commando. The commando, the special forces, secret services are actually these crazy people that the state has, but with license. Now I'm telling you firsthand, some of them are here in the audience. Crazy people, believe me, but disciplined, restrained, following some regulations, unique regulations that can help you fight and cope against crazy people without regulations, with no paradigm. Now, why it's a big problem? It's a big problem because actually the force buildup of our nations is based on our traumas from the Great War. And no nation will get rid of its tanks, jet fighters, some even has carriers and submarines, etc. And up there you see on the top of the pyramid there are these brave people, the commandos, the special forces and the secret services that looks like candies on the cake. It's not the cake, it is candies. But the only effective capability against people that act with no paradigm are people that knows how to adapt and to act with no paradigm but officially. And it cannot be only candies on the cake, it should be the cake itself. So what I'm gonna suggest is just to make a change and to change the force buildup and to allocate much more resources to develop much bigger capability of secret services, special forces, and commandos, and not only candies on the cake. To make it, let's say, I'll compromise with you, to all of you that are shocked from my presentation, let's say half of the cake. Because we need divisions, brigades, and battalions. We need to protect our borders with, let's say, conventional, standard-like forces and capabilities, but we must change the budget allocation and the state of mind into different type of armed forces. Now we see in Israel that, for an example, I've been honored to be the first deputy commander of the newly born IDF Depth Command. And it has been published that Israel actually started the new commando brigade. And we are doing a lot because along the years, as you know, we had our special forces, we are very proud of them, but it should be a bigger part of the cake. It should change our state of mind. And we must make sure that we will be able to integrate all our capabilities into one socket, one backbone. Because it should be the police special forces with the gendarmeria special forces, with the border guard special forces, with the military special forces, and all the other forces, the regular ones, the conventional ones, should take their plugs and be able to plug and play. It means that the C for ISR must change. And to be able to use the same backbone, same communication protocols, etc., and to be able to plug and play. And another advantage with special forces, secret services, and commandos, they are very flexible. They can adapt very quickly. They can understand insurgents, terrorists, and guerrillas because they think quite the same, but they are just the official version of the country. When you have a big capability of these other boots on the ground, not regular boots, special forces boots on the ground, you can use your dimmer and decide where are you on the spectrum. It's much more easily because when you send the 82nd Division or the 91st Division here, or you send the 101st, it's just like sending a bulldozer. You cannot use a regular type of division against insurgents, against lonely wolves, against these dots in the perpetua mobile I showed you before, under the iceberg. You cannot send divisions there. You need to be able to adapt and to create the right mix, the right algorithm to send it to the same place, and to use the demerent to decide as a decision maker in the government what will be today the ingredients and the algorithmics that you'll use against this and that threat. Let's make it 30. Now it means actually that C4ISR is not enough anymore. When you want to be effective in a specific place on Earth, actually, today you need to add 2 more C's to your algorithm of force buildup. The second one, or the 5th C, will be the cyber. Because the cybernetic warfare, it's a part of our lives. As I mentioned before, we must be able to protect ourselves and be able even to attack, and to be able to make offensive maneuvers in the cybernetic warfare. But if you want really to be able to leave the box, to act globally, to adapt, to change, to create every time a different type of solution, let's say, and to fight effectively, you need to be able to bring different boxes worldwide as a community that fights against these terrorists and these dots that are everywhere around the globe. It means that if we will be able to change, to adapt, and to create these new algorithms worldwide, it means that we will be able to change also the way that we look at the theater. If we know that we can act everywhere, undercover, covert missions, overt missions, and not as, you know, a small capability of one nation, but as the huge capability of community of nations, all speaking the same languages, everyone can take the plug and put it into the socket and plug and play it globally, not only inside the state, but worldwide. I believe that that can be an effective toolkit and proactive toolkit against terrorists. This is the C6ISR theory, and I believe that it is not a theory, it is the real life, and if we want to be effective, we should adapt that and to change totally the force buildup for the next 2-3 decades until we will be able to reduce the amount of spectacular events of black swans and to bring our counter black swan capability, which won't be regular armies, divisions, regular police forces and others. It should be this kind of capabilities. Thank you.
I'll try to be brave and provide you 2 questions for Gal, if you have. Yes, sir.
Most militaries in the reserve force are training for foreign war. As you pointed out, the box is shifted. Does it make sense to take a portion of this military and train them for homeland defense? By that I mean crowd control, first aid, take out shooters, etc. Put them in civilian clothes, embed them in the public, and just let them go around their life. In the United States, there are a lot of people that have guns, but they don't have training. My question is, would you make a cadre, a large cadre, because these guys would not necessarily have to be that physically fit, but they would have to train on a regular basis and embed them in the population?
Well, thank you. That's a good point. I think that one of the most important things, speaking about my C6ISR capabilities, is the legal issue. And I think that, you know, it looks a very good idea to take a portion of your capabilities and to spread it among regular civil lives and to make sure that you protect it. But remember, this is exactly your secret services role in a democracy. Now, if you take regular forces, let's say, and transform them into behavior of secret services, it's a challenge. I'm afraid it will create big problems, and it will destroy a part, it may destroy a part of your democracy. You should be well trained, believe me, you know, to train one of my operators in the special forces takes 3 years of training. Then they start to serve. Now think about these people that you transform them into were civil and behave differently. It's a big challenge. And I think that we need to change the force build-up of the secret services and special forces, and maybe to transform some of the people. Anyhow, it won't be something that you can do in a heartbeat, you know, in a minute. I'm speaking about the process. We must change, we must adapt. I will take from your words one thing. No doubt that today's challenges takes much of our efforts into the home front commands. And you know, there was a tragedy in Israel a few days ago when a parking lot has been collapsed. And our home front command search and rescue unit had to work very hard to save lives and to find, unfortunately, bodies under the wreckage. And I just thought, what's going to happen, not only in earthquake, of course, this is force majeure. What's going to happen when we will have a strike from all our enemies parallel as they try to do that, and we didn't have our Iron Dome and other capabilities, and how many areas like this we can cope with. I think that we need to put much more efforts and resources in the home front. It means search and rescue, of course, but we speak about special forces, intelligence, etc. Yes, we must protect ourselves, but I don't think that it should be in the way of taking paratroopers, reserve paratroopers, and put them in the streets with suits. You see what happens to me, a paratrooper with a suit. I do not feel comfortable. It's not for me.
Yes, last.
Do you see in your military, I work with militaries around the world, but do you have in your organization, do you have a mechanism by which you introduce your command staff personnel once they reach a certain rank and orientate them to the capabilities of your special operations folks, how to use them and how to embed them within the conventional forces effectively? And have you exported that program?
Yes, of course we teach, we train, and we use special forces as a part of the regular maneuvers and deployment everywhere, and there is a manual of how to integrate special capabilities inside your mission or inside your maneuver. Regarding export in Israel, it usually depends on export license, and as you know, we are following regulations, and my company, for an example, Defensive Shield Holdings Company, it's a fully guided company by the Israeli MOD, every step, every item, every detail. It happens mainly with our allies. And yes, the State of Israel, and you can ask Nitzan, that was the director of counterterrorism in Israel, we cooperate and even create strong partnerships with any nation that wants to take counterterrorism as a part of its policy. And if so, Israel will support it usually. That's what's going to happen. And we have, unfortunately, a lot of experience of integrating special forces into regular maneuvering or regular missions everywhere. I just want to tell you that the issue that I'm speaking about, just to make sure and to clarify it, is not how to integrate a component of special ops inside your regular forces, but to make special ops as your regular maneuver. I'm speaking about maneuvering strategically and operationally, of course, by C6 ISR capabilities.
Politically, that's a very hard nut to crack.
Yes, for sure.
We will take a 10 minutes break for coffee in the next floor. Please be back in 11:10 on your seats, and then Brian will take the lead. Thanks.
Joining the RAND Corporation, I was a soldier, and spent my entire military service in special forces in Latin America and in Southeast Asia during the war, where I did 4 tours, and therefore I'm both an admirer and extremely sympathetic to the comments made by General Hirsch in terms of the role of special forces in dealing with these issues. Vietnam is a splendid example of what he was talking about in terms of the inappropriate application of force. In Vietnam, we dealt with an adversary that was on average about 5 feet tall, moved at a speed of about 3 to 4 miles an hour, and had an AK-47. We had aircraft that could fly at 50,000 feet, at 600 miles an hour. We could drop tons of ordnance and had the most modern weapons on Earth. The problem was that our military capability did not intersect the adversary we were dealing with at all, so much of what we did was completely irrelevant. As I say, our capabilities simply didn't intersect those of our foes, with the exception of special forces, where we created a tribal force in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia that was approximately 5 feet tall, moved at about 3 to 4 miles an hour, and instead of AK-47s had M1 carbines, which was more than sufficient, because this was not a contest of ordnance. This was not a contest of air power. This was a very primitive, low-level conflict. I think that was on display again in the Iraq War, when at that time the American armed forces, even more splendidly equipped than our forces were in Vietnam, were engaging initially the Iraqi army, and of course we could drive across the desert at 50 miles an hour, shooting all the way. The good news was that in 3 weeks we had Baghdad. The bad news was that in 3 weeks we had Baghdad, and at that point were thoroughly ill-equipped, ill-trained to deal with the chaos that followed and the circumstances. And in the years since 9/11 and since the Iraq War, we have tried to learn a lesson, and to a degree have applied, indeed, the recommendation of General Hirsch in the 1960s and early 1970s when I was in Special Forces. This was still the height of the Cold War. The United States Armed Forces had 2 million men under arms, of which approximately 10,000 were Special Forces. That was the candy on top of the cake. Today, because of post-Cold War reductions, we have fewer than 1 million men under arms, still a large armed forces, including the National Guard. But we have a Joint Special Operations Command of approximately 80,000, I think is the last figure that I saw. So it represents a much larger component of our total armed forces. And it is a vital component of American counter-terrorist efforts. It is not the entire answer, and so as I say, it is a vital component, it is a necessary component, but it doesn't get us all the way there. Also, to underscore General Hirsch's comments, war, the kind of war that he displayed on his slide there of World War I and World War II, I used to have fights with my father, who was a soldier in Patton's army in World War II, and he would lament how dangerous the world and terrible the world was that I lived, and he knew, of course, I worked on terrorism issues, and would lament that, and I took certain mischievous pleasure in pointing out to him that in his day, World War I and World War II, resulted in 100 million fatalities in those two wars. When it comes to mechanized slaughter, civilized nations with advanced armies that are evenly matched on the battlefield can do it at an extraordinary level. And fortunately, in looking at the world since World War II, and especially looking at the world over the last 25 or 30 years, that type of warfare is declining. So we're not seeing the kinds of wars worldwide that, for example, Israel engaged in 48 and 56 and 67 and in 73 and lost over, if I'm not mistaken, over 10,000 soldiers in those conflicts. Altogether, about 10,000. And we're seeing a different kind of war, a different kind of engagement that produces fewer casualties, but is nonetheless extremely effective in other dimensions. Now, as that kind of war and the casualties connected with those conflicts are declining in the world, the bad news is that terrorism is increasing in the world, and it's increasing both as a component of warfare, so that the majority of wars today, interstate war is a very rare thing today, but in the internal wars that we see, which may include some conventional fighting, guerrilla warfare, but also a large terrorist component of that warfare. So terrorism has become a mode of conflict, but even then outside of those conflict zones, we see a significant amount of terrorism, because terrorism is a mode of conflict that makes no distinctions between front lines and home fronts, between combatants and non-combatants. And we are dealing with that kind of asymmetric situation now. My final comment on General Hirsch's presentation was he had raised this question of how do we identify you know, that person in the crowd that can move from 1 to 100 miles an hour in a heartbeat. And in a sense, that's what this workshop is about, in my view. Now, I will admit to you that I prepared slides in advance. I sometimes do this, but then having arrived at this conference and listening to the presentations and listening to the presentations here, have discarded those altogether because this is a workshop, and this is where we get to think about these issues. And so at the cost of perhaps a less polished presentation backed up by PowerPoints, let me instead talk about some things that have been provoked by the presentations. So instead of PowerPoint, ladies and gentlemen, this is what we're going with. And you know, we start off with this notion, proactive. You know, what, this is about proactive. This is an interesting word. What the hell does proactive mean? This is a term that actually came into the vocabulary in the 1930s and in some aspects of psychology, but it was really became a popular term in dealing with issues like management issues, maintenance issues, and policing in the 1980s. Proactive as opposed to reactive. Law enforcement is traditionally reactive. If you ever watch the American television show Law and Order, or the various versions of that in Europe, a crime is committed, the police investigate the crime, identify the perpetrator, bring that perpetrator to justice. That's a reactive approach. So when we say proactive, we're talking about something that takes place in a sense earlier on. We're going to move ahead of that. People describe that in various ways. In the United States, we talk about staying to the left of the boom. Let me see, you read Hebrew backwards, so we'd say to the right of the boom, I suppose, in Israel. But whichever side, the idea is that there will be some kind of intervention before the terrible event occurs. That is proactive. And there are a lot of developments that have been pushing us in the direction of this preemptive intervention, pushing us upstream. One is the sheer scale of terrorism. Terrorism has escalated over the decades. The worst incidents of terrorism in the 1970s were measured in tens of fatalities. In the 1980s, this ascended into the hundreds of fatalities. Of course, on 9/11, it ascended into the thousands of fatalities. That was an order of magnitude increased almost every decade, and people were looking at scenarios post 9/11 in which there could theoretically be tens of thousands of fatalities resulting from terrorist use of possible use of weapons of mass destruction. So one clearly was escalation. Now, fortunately, that extrapolation has not occurred yet. We haven't ascended into these higher domains. And in fact, right now, 9/11 appears like to be a statistical outlier. However, these more recent events that may involve something in the low hundreds, or something like Paris with 130, or Nice with 84 people, or even less than that, Orlando with 49, nonetheless, the nature of these episodes, the fact that they are directed against ordinary targets, restaurants, nightclubs, a rock concert, a public gathering of people, drives home the message that no one is safe. And here is a case where the fear and alarm that is caused by these events is greater than and trumps the calculation of personal risks. So we can point to we can point to the fact that the average American has about a 1 in 8,000 chance of dying in an automobile accident. The average American has about a 1 in 18,000 chance of being a victim of ordinary homicide. By the way, in the United States, if one is a victim of ordinary homicide, chances are 4 to 1 it will be at the hands of a close friend or a relative. I never quite know what to do with that statistic, avoid family gatherings or what. But nonetheless, the odds of being a victim of terrorism in the United States approach the odds of winning the lottery. Makes no difference, because we're not dealing with objective calculations of risk assessment here. We are dealing with what terrorism is all about. Terrorism is about creating fear and alarm. It works, people are frightened, but that has real consequences. That fear turns into crises for governments. Government is seen not to be able to protect its citizens. It creates divisiveness in society. It can break societies apart and create tensions. So this has real consequences. So escalation and the nature of terrorism is pushing us in the direction of intervention. Another aspect of it, of course, is that we try to think of, well, we increase physical security. And you have to increase physical security, you do. But here again, we have to be realistic about that. Physical security does not end terrorism. Physical security displaces the risk. So there is no target or set of targets that I cannot, with some difficulty and some expense, erect a new security perimeter. And if we're talking about public places, my net security benefit from doing that is to oblige my determined terrorists to drive another 2 blocks to carry out an attack at another vulnerable public place where they will get the same return on the investment. There is no terrorist attack that goes uncommitted as a consequence of physical security itself. So while it is necessary, we don't win on physical security, and it's becoming more and more difficult because terrorists are moving in the direction of softer and softer targets. In fact, we are moving toward what might be called pure terrorism, I'll put that in quotes, and that is where, as a terrorist, I will kill anybody. Doesn't make any difference. School, children, hospital, anything, I will kill anybody, anywhere, anytime, to make my point. Now, terrorists have, therefore, an advantage in that equation in that they can attack anyone, anywhere, anytime. We cannot protect everything, everywhere, all the time. They win. So again, the escalation of terrorism, the targeting of terrorism, the limitations of physical security measures push us toward intervening. We are constantly trying to move upstream here. Now, we can think about doing that in terms of from the immediate moment to further and further and further back. At what point do we preempt? So we'll start with can we discern behavior indicating imminent criminal intent? Now this is where we're at that heartbeat that you mentioned in your approach. Are there things that we can observe? This was a real issue in Israel during the Second Intifada. I mean, bus drivers were trained to recognize waiting passengers at bus stops for certain indicators to indicate whether or not they were going to stop at that bus stop. Because if there was indications of a suicide bomber, it was an inconvenience for some people, but safer to keep that bus going. That's an example of looking at a behavior. Obviously, it was also developed, especially here in Israel, looking for indicators of suicide bombers. Were there modes of dress? Were there modes of behavior? Were there indicators that would allow observers to identify an individual as a suicide bomber? Now, in a certain sense, in today's world, even though the Intifada was not that long ago, technology is taking us far beyond that. And a combination of closed-circuit TV, analytics, big data is pushing some research right now so that can one really surveil crowds of people and look for, we'll call the algorithms of behavior, the indicators of behavior that says this individual might be something we want to observe and even intervene. And that is being pushed. Now, let's take it one step back, or one mile further upstream. Behavior indicating suspicion. Can we recognize that? And here again, we have precedents for this. Following the first terrorist hijacking, there were lots of hijackings before that, but the first terrorist hijacking in 1968 of an El Al aircraft, ultimately resolved, but led to the decision by the government of Israel, by El Al, that there were not going to be any more El Al airliners hijacked. And it led to the development of security measures that are still the basis for aviation security in Israel, and that is focusing very much on the passengers and identifying those passengers that pose less risk and those that pose greater risk. Now, that's a completely different model from the American model, which is looking for objects. In other words, the American system is passenger neutral, and it looks for objects. The Israeli system looks at the passenger. Now, to be sure, the Israelis have some advantages here in terms of the demographics of the passengers flying on El Al, but that is clearly the thing. When I served on the White House Commission on Aviation Security in 1996, we introduced something called CAPS. CAPS was computer-assisted passenger screening, and it was based upon algorithms that were taken off the PNR, that's the passenger numerical record. That begins when you make a reservation, you start your PNR, and that's the thing that has the code of letters that then follows you all the way through the flight. And there was certain information on that in terms of routes, passenger identification. Had nothing to do with race or religion or anything like that. It had to do with, without going into all of the details, how was How was the ticket purchased? Was it part of something else? You know, so that a family of a mother and father and small children going from California to Disney World in Orlando with reservations made at Disney World and a rental car at the end was probably less of a threat than someone who came to the ticket counter at the last moment carrying a golf bag and said, "How much is it to 39,000 feet?" I'm being facetious about this because I don't want to get into the details of the algorithm. Wasn't bad, by the way. CAPS on the morning of 9/11 identified 9 of the 19 hijackers. Now, by that time, of course, the airlines did not like CAPS because it was a pain in the ass. And so they had disconnected the system from doing anything about it. So the system was identifying people, but at the checkpoint doesn't mean a damn thing. And they walked right through. A different form of CAPS was in effect also in 2001 in Paris when the shoe bomber attempted to board an airline, American Airlines, to fly to the United States, and the system said, take a look at this guy. The airline said, we don't want to let him on board. They turned him over to the French police. The French police interviewed him at length, decided he was not a threat, and let him proceed. Fortunately, by that time, and this is the intervention of higher authority, fortunately, by that time, he had missed the plane and it departed. So he spent the night in Paris, came back to board that same flight the following day. The system said, again, take a look at this guy. The French said, we already looked at him. He's good to go. That was the shoe bomber. Now, the fortunate part is that he spent the night in Paris wearing the same shoes with the device in it, the explosives. This is not a metallic commercial detonator, but a detonator that you had to light with a match. It had rained in Paris that night, so he walked around in the rain. The fuse was wet. It didn't work. But the system did. So these are examples of intervening on the basis of behavior indicating suspicion. Our participant from the City of London, the Assistant Commissioner, talked to us about their program in London, which is extensively going to use behavioral detection and talking to people and intervening. So we back up one, and we are looking for people then who are prone to violence. And again, this is done by parole boards. It's done in some cases, and it's based upon big data, massive statistics, and looking for algorithms that indicate, look, if we've got someone here that is unemployed, has aggression problems, previous run-ins with the law, etc., this is a high-risk individual. Now that's individuals who you can identify. We back up from that and we try to look at radicalization on a wholesale basis and try to identify either a wholesale basis where we look at communities at risk, a kind of a euphemism, or where we try to look at individuals who are at risk and identify them and intervene. And this is what Shira was talking about in these programs to intervene and to prevent radicalization. As I said before, this is new territory and considerable caution is in order. Then we try to back up even further and look at a terrorist-prone personality. The first ones to try to do this were the German authorities in looking at the Red Army faction, about a Meinhof gang in the 1970s. They did a 5-volume study of terrorists in prison. With Teutonic thoroughness, they looked at every aspect of their lives to ultimately conclude that there were no distinguishing, they weren't crazy in the clinical sense, and there was no distinguishing features. But psychology and neuroscience have come a long way since then, and so we heard at this conference Ariel Murari talk about a new research effort to go back and to look at these people around the world, and as we have with suicide bombers, to see if we can come up with some kind of a useful profile. We'll go back to the next step, which is the neuroscience, and that is by brain scanning and looking at responses to certain prompts and certain development. We now have psychiatrists, researchers, that are claiming that as early as 6 months we can determine whether or not a person is more or less likely to be prone to violence. That is getting into science fiction territory, but that is an area. Now, we also try to do this environmentally, and that is to look at root causes, or to counter violent extremism, where we're not trying to identify individuals, but we're trying to address entire communities. At the international level, we have moved into an area which is interesting, in which we've established policies. Israel did this first. The U.S. announced this as a component of its policy, where Israel, the United States now too, will, in order to prevent terrorists from acquiring or using weapons of mass destruction, the government will take preemptive, unilateral military action if necessary. And that is stated policy of Israel, was done in Iraq, and in Syria it is a stated policy of the United States. But that also then gets us something from where we are moving now, and that is preemptive war. That is where we will take on groups, not on the basis of whether or not they've attacked the United States yet, as we are doing with ISIS, and there's two ways to look at ISIS. It's either a progeny of Al-Qaeda, and it's just an extension of our continuing war, or, in a sense, we are waging preventive war. We are saying ISIS could become a launching pad for future terrorist attacks on the United States, therefore we will destroy ISIS. Now, final word on this is all of this is fascinating and interesting, and in a sense is understandable. But this is really pushing us into new territory that has consequences in terms of international law, consequences in terms of civil liberties, consequences in terms of how we organize our societies. We are on the edge of creating situations that are the stuff of political science fiction. Thank you very much.
Questions for our third speaker? Yes, sir. You have a question?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Thank you for very I was intrigued by your use of the term environmental, because I'm an environmental activist. You talk about groups at risk. Frame that concept in terms of their exposure to incentives.
No, I mean,
indoctrination.
yeah. Look, when we look at some of these, it's different in different societies. I mean, when we look at our situation in the United States, to be sure, we have some communities that are at risk. To give a concrete example, the, of the many Somali immigrant communities in the United States, one in Minnesota, one in Minneapolis, was the source of an active recruiting effort. What was driving that was there were some active recruiters in there that were inciting and connecting these young men and facilitating their travel to Somalia. If you look at some of the communities in France and in Belgium, where we find these subcultures that transcend both the criminal world and the radical underground, the criminal underworld and a radical underground, in some cases, there is radicalization that has been going on in those communities over the last 20 years, and there are identifiable inciters of violence, and the Europeans, different European countries, have tried to address this by placing individuals under house arrest or by deporting those who were not citizens, or most recently, I think the most recent conviction I can think of is in the United Kingdom, where an individual, Chowdhury, was identified as a source of continuing incitement. So part of the legal push upstream is two things. One, in the United States, to make intent to commit a terrorist-related crime itself a crime. That is, you don't have to commit the crime. The mere demonstrable intent is itself a crime. And by expanding the legal domain of incitement, so that that can be attacked directly. So that's what that is.
You're talking about the typhoid Mary models. What about the word pollution, total miasmic approach to lead?
In terms of, if you're talking about the internet and things of that sort, yeah. I mean, obviously a problem, and people are addressing that in terms of, there are discussions about this. To be sure, the social media companies are under pressure and to a certain degree responding to remove illegal content, to remove obvious incitement content as quickly as possible. So that is being done. There is an issue that one of the most important things, by the way, in moving upstream is intelligence, which I did not get into. It's intelligence. And one of the negative consequences, if we were to shut down certain aspects of the internet altogether, would be the internet is a tremendous source of intelligence and of early identification of individuals. Many of the successful investigations in the United States that led to arrests and convictions began with individuals who were identified via their activities on the internet.
Thanks. We switch our speaker, so the next speaker will be Colonel Mofaz. Please take the lead.
Thank you, Nitzan. As you see, I'm going to speak about intelligence. Mr. Jenkins just mentioned it, and this is one of the main challenges dealing with terrorism. A few years ago, a Canadian professor who dealing with political science and intelligence said that learning to live with an open-ended war on terrorism will mean learn to live with intelligence. That's right. This is one of the main tools to deal with terrorism. A few years later, a more famous person, the President of the United States, Barack Obama, said after an event of what we call the Christmas Day event in 2009, that intelligence is the first line of defense and the first line of countering terrorism and threats. So the event was a person who went from Amsterdam to Detroit and tried to detonate his underpants with chemical thing, and he failed. And the intelligence didn't find him in advance, even though the American community did a lot of changes after the event of 9/11. So the intelligence is a great tool, but intelligence needs to deal with a lot of challenges. First of all, there is a lot of information today. Dealing with intelligence more than 30 years, I can tell you that the amount are huge today. It was mentioned that the internet and the social network, it's a tool for communication, tool for inspiration, tool for distribution and direction and action. The terrorists are using a lot with the social media. The organizations, which is one of the structure tool of the terrorists, are today more organized. They are what we call some kind of hybrid organizations. This is a combination of terrorism and guerrilla warfare. The organizations start with guerrilla, then go to terrorism, and then to semi-military organizations. And today, as we see in, for example, in ISIS, in Hezbollah, with Hamas, with Boko Haram, they have military arm, they have diplomatic or political wing, they have social and community complex, they control over territory, and they control over population. So it's more complicated deal with this kind of organization. But also we have what we call the lone wolf, and when we'll elaborate it later about the lone wolf, if it's lone or not. But the lone wolf is also what we call the new threat. The threat, the lone wolf, all the combination of inspiration, motivation, planning, decision-taking, timing, when to launch the attack, how to do it, mainly between his 2 ears. But as you know, wolves in the nature are going with groups, are not alone. And we'll see later what does it mean not be alone. The characteristic and challenge for the intelligence is dealing with religious motivations of the terrorist, multicultural. It means that you are first generation or second generation, for example, in Europe. The origin is from North Africa or for the Middle East. You have your culture from home, you have the new culture of the West, but you don't adapt it. And there's a conflict between the culture that you have at home and the culture that you have outside, and then it gives you some inspiration to do other things through the media. Also, today there is a lot of changes in the way of terror activity, in the way it's act, and we can see that the greater, what we call the greater Middle East, from Iraq, Syria, our area here, Sinai, and North Africa, this is the main place of activity of the terrorist. The intelligence need to deal with all these challenges. There are things that he needs to do, that are things that he should to do and want to do. First of all, the intelligence need to understand the threat, mainly when we are speaking about terrorism threat, its intention and motivation and capabilities. So you need to describe the threat first of all. You need to understand it. You need to interpret, put the assessment, analyze the threat for your customers, and of course, if you can, give an alert before the attack. On the other hand, intelligence wants to influence in two sides. First of all, on the threat, to prevent the threat or to reduce the threat. On the other hand, intelligence have influence on the decision makers. What policy do they need to take on operations? You can't do any kind of commando operation on any kind of other dealing with activity or army activity, special forces, undercover, without intelligence. And one of the most important things that I think is the assimilation of the knowledge and the interpretations of what the intelligence understand about the terrorist. They need to be with a combination of conversation with the decision makers. But the intelligence is not dealing and not acting in open space. There is some interfaces with other areas. As I say, with the operational area, with law, we spoke about it in this panel, some of my colleagues mentioned it, what you can do, what you can do, ethics and morals, human rights, for example, in interrogations, all the issue of money and support and economic issues of this terrorist organization. They need money, they need some activity to bring money, sometimes it's connecting with crime, and also, since it's a global issue, international relations change and see what your neighbors, what other countries has about intelligence. On the other hand, I spoke about challenges, and there are big challenges, and there is more, of course. But these challenges sometimes gives an opportunity to the intelligence. The patterns of the terrorists today give some opportunities to the intelligence. First of all, if now they are organized, more organized, they are more visible, they are more exposure. The routine, when you do a routine activity, this is a weak point. The intelligence needs to take an advantage. Targets, infrastructure, targeting killings, leaders, command and control. You're more organized, you're more exposed. You're more exposed, you have more targets for intelligence, and intelligence needs to find it. The funding. If you're a big organization, there's a lot of funding, and you need to cut the oxygen of the terrorist organization, the funding. And all the living space of the organization, it's very important, and intelligence needs to find this. This is some weak points of organizations. The lone wolf, are they operating alone? Not exactly. Because they have footprints in the network, they have footprints in social media, they have family around them, there are affiliates around them. So there are some clues that you need to find them. Of course, sometimes the decision from the time that the lone wolf take the decision to act until he do it, it could take hours, days, and sometimes it's on between his 2 years that we spoke before. But there is some footprints around, and we need to find it. Most of the activity of the lone wolves and part of the terror organizations are in the social media. So they are using advanced technology. Advanced technology, it means that most of the information today is in the public domain. if we're looking about 20 or 40 years ago, 30 years ago, it was undercover activity. You need a very unique resources. I'm not saying that very classified information, it's not needed. But today, since it's global, since the messages, directions, and all this stuff, it's social network in Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and whatever, it's there. It's a lot of amount of information. You need to search, you need to find, you need to detect, but you can find it. You need to follow the leads, as I mentioned before, President Obama said, you need to follow the leads, you need to connect the dots. There is one sign here, one sign there, someone is speaking on phone, then you see the same person on the internet, and on the Facebook, and then in the Twitter. We need to connect all these clues together with technology and see the big picture. But when you're dealing with intelligence and terrorism, you don't need to forget the details. It's a lot of details. You need to see the big picture, but you need to deal with a lot of details. The technology also, it's of course an opportunity for the intelligence. Using innovative technology to find all these clues. Data mining is meaning that to find the details from a large amount of databases. You need to learn about trends and patterns. So sometimes there's a pattern of activity. You need to find it. The link analysis means to link between name, car number, ID number, flight number, and all this kind. So find the links between these people. Semantic text analysis, it means automatically find meaning of text. Meanings of text that are going in the internet, in the Facebook, on the social media. And sentiment analysis. Sentiment analysis is mean that you can understand the feelings of the one who is writing post on the internet, or people are doing like or not like to this, what he said. So you can understand that people are favor with what he's doing or not favor it. So machines can help the analyst to find these clues on the big space of the internet. And of course, at the end, data fusion. To take different kind of information, it could be interception of a call, it could be a post on the internet, it could be a message on WhatsApp, and connect them and bring them to the same level. And for that, you need to deal with big data. A lot of people speak about big data. It's some kind of buzzword, but I'm not talking about a buzzword. When you're talking about big data, it's the 3 V's. Volume, extreme amount of data, number types of data, as I say, interception of call, post on the internet, photo from a security camera, and all this kind. You need to connect between them, and velocity, the speed of data processing. Today, you need to have a capability to deal with millions of terabytes of informations and know to connect them. But to deal really with the terrorist, you need a unified system. And I just put it some details that every unified system dealing with terrorists need to have. Every detail about the suspects and potential suspects and people who were connected with them, and social media profile in Facebook and in Twitter, and keywords. Every keyword that is a keyword that connect to terrorism, murder, killing, or all the others keywords. Passport numbers, if you have, pictures, face recognition, voice recognition, population registry. So if you go from one country to another, just mentioned here, the Schengen issue in Europe, so you can go to, as Gal here said, to Zurich and then be in Brussels and no one knows about you. So you need all the details, that every detail you have a suspect in one big system. It's not so simple, but that it's things that you must do. At the end, you have to build an international suspect database. It's not easy, I know, because there is an issue of classification, security clearance, but as I said before, if more of the information today is in open sources, if you have a profile of suspect in the Facebook, of profile on the Twitter, or have an ID number, I don't see any reason why not to share it with other countries. So if you take the Western countries of fighting terrorism today and build an international suspect database, and you can check every name immediately, and if he came from Europe to the Middle East and go back, I think this is one of the best things to do when you're dealing with this. But the technology is not enough. We need to remember that we have the human factor. Even with the human factor, you need to take some advantages for the network. The intelligence, the expert should take part in the extreme ideological discussions on the internet, the forums, the closed groups, the chat rooms, all this, you need to be there, undercover, know the language, know the behavior, know how to deal with this. The multinational recruiters, people from different countries who are recruiting to terror organization, it's a potential for human sources, for spies, for undercover people that can go there and bring you information. And since it's from a lot of countries, there is a lot of opportunities. So it's not only an advantage for the terrorists if they're going to ISIS, it's an advantage of the countries that they came from England, from France, from Belgium, from other places. So it can give you an exclusive access to terror organizations. I know, and the people who deals with intelligence knows that dealing with human source intelligence, it's complex, it's time-consuming, it takes time, but it's valuable. If you have 1, 2, 3 sources in headquarters of ISIS, in Syria, in Iraq, in other places, you can have a lot of information dealing with this issue. But not only spies and human sources or virtual human sources, it's enough. One of the most important things that dealing with the human source is the interrogations and arrests. And I know this is open questions about law and all these issues, but if you interrogate not monitor, not see what he's going to do, interrogate him, interrogate his family, interrogate his friends, you can have a lot of information that you can't find, not on this internet, not on the Facebook, not on the Twitter, and not in other people's. For example, citizens from Western countries who are going to visit in Syria and Iraq, what they're going to do there? Tourism? Fun? Spa? No. Most of the people that are going to this area are going to connected to terror activity. If not, okay, so interrogate them. Everyone who came back from these countries should be interrogated in his country automatically, not be monitored or under surveillance. Interrogate him, arrest him, ask questions. And a lot of countries don't do it. Of course, as I said, this issue raised problems of human rights, law, ethics in one side. On the other side, as a citizen of Western country, I'm not talking about Israel only, you have the human rights to be protected, and your government need to protect you. So human rights in